designers, one of the things we do essentially is to work in the virtual world. We start with sometimes a site, sometimes a brief, but then immediately we start also with a relatively blank sheet. And we sort of have to dream what we're going to do. We have to sort of imagine what we're going to do. And often our project starts like this. That is one of my projects. It's the Pierre Vive project in Montpellier, and that's how it started. This first physical expression was this little maquette, which was about 10 centimeters long, and we went on to sort of sketch it, understand it, and then at some point we get to a real building. So we have to work a long time in the virtual world. We tend to use a whole variety, and each of the disciplines in this room and each of the people involved in the construction industry use their own sort of representations in a way. Those are many, from sort of very initial sort of sketches to models, sort of trying to figure out ideas, models that get more established, more firm, and representations. Of course, now we're moving into sort of virtual models, which are even more sort of firm representation of the geometric world that we live in. Presentation models. Also, we do a lot of actual virtual modeling of the behavior of our buildings. That one actually is an acoustic model about 15 years ago. So I believe our acoustic people have now moved on a great deal and sort of can make you listen to your buildings instead of try to visualize the behavior of the sound. But actually I chose it because of its visual qualities to an extent. So each discipline has got its own way of abstracting the work we do. One of the projects I worked on is the Kask Stadium in Jeddah. And we did an enormous amount of structural analysis for that project, especially seismic. And you may think this is actually not a very obvious representation of the building. It's about a quarter of that building. And it's the dynamic seismic load case. So each discipline, and structural engineers have got their own ways of doing that, is choosing his own way of abstracting the real. And in our case, we will be using sort of properties of materials, we'll be using the sizes of the elements, we'll be using abstraction of how the elements are connected to each other, so that we hopefully capture the real behavior of what we're going to build. To validate our modelizations and our abstractions, we often get to the point of even testing them in prototypes. And that's a prototype of the Millennium Bridge, which was more done to validate the lighting analysis that had been done and make sure there would be enough lighting on the deck. But it also served many other purposes of validation of the design. Unfortunately, it's not absolute done deal that we understand everything and that we have a full representation of the real and the behavior of both structures and people. In the case of the Millennium Bridge, you all know what happened on the opening day, and clearly something had not been represented correctly in our virtual models of the bridge. So one might say that we have to learn about the real at all steps of what we do. But I think there's something even more fundamental than that in its value. I think there are industries and there are things in life that you wouldn't even dream of doing in the virtual world. You wouldn't dream of modeling your food first. You're going to want to experience it. You're going to want to directly touch it, smell it, eat it. It's not something that we can do in the construction industry. We have to sort of go through various phases before that. But I think there's something very fundamental about experiencing building at their full scale. You know, when is the last time you got excited or wowed or even emotionally attracted to a virtual model? Quite unlikely, I would say. And so I think there's definitely something to say for the real buildings, the real world in what we do. You know, buildings are to be appreciated in full. You have to go and see them. You have to go and visit them, enter them, turn around them, and you then might have an idea of how the light plays with them, how the sort of orientation, the scale, the relation to yourself might be. Kant probably said it also in quite a more potent way. You know, basically, a stair is not just an element you get out of a model or a catalogue. It's an important event in a building, and I think we sometimes forget that what we build are not just a collection of pieces, but actually also an experience that is to be enjoyed and benefited from. We also, when we go and see our building, can get up close and personal. These images are, you know, details, in a way, of projects that you probably quite know well. This one, of course, is the Millennium Bridge. But have you ever looked up close to the Sydney Opera House? That is the tiling that is on the Sydney Opera House. And I think, in a way, the fact that somebody cared enough to clad these large surfaces into this actually quite small tiling arrangement, quite complex and quite well thought of, in order to give it more of a tactile feel and also more of a sort of human scale, is quite important. That one is a little cathedral in Lille whose facade has been done with marble and has a wonderfully translucent light through it. When I was preparing this talk, of course, you listen, you read, you start sort of thinking, where am I, what am I going to say? And sometimes you come across somebody saying something to you which really clicks. And I was in Paris listening to the TV to an interview of Christian Porzenparc, who's a famous French architect. And he was saying how important it was to him that his architecture didn't remain just drawings, but got built, that it didn't remain just in imagination. And the journalist asked him, but why? Why do you want your buildings to be built? And he said, well, you know, it's the vérité de l'espace, it's the light. Vérité de l'espace is the truth of the space. It doesn't translate very well, actually, in English, but it was really, you know, it's the experience of what we're doing. And other architects, such as, you know, Zumthor, for example, really have that in them. This real sort of importance of the light. This is a Nasher gallery in Dallas and Zaha project. And again, another thing that sort of clicked as we were preparing for this talk was we were preparing for another conversation, another talk about the digital world. And somebody said exactly this sentence: we can do everything in the virtual world, but unfortunately we have to build it. And that really made me ask myself the question, why is it that we say unfortunately? Is it that difficult? Is it so painful to make all these pieces and assemble them? Is it something that we don't derive any joy from being involved? I've always loved going to site. I've always loved going to the makers of our building. And I think basically, you know, the material side of what we do and its very sort of powerful source, nature, is extremely important. You know, we are rearranging nature when we build our buildings. We are taking materials and transforming them from their initial, slightly imperfect and slightly random aspects into something which is probably more ordered, more predictable, and that we can then calculate and build. But there is something to say for the imperfections and the sort of natural qualities of what we do. You know, nature can be absolutely amazing. Actually, a structural engineer talking about nature and material is nothing terribly original, but I'm afraid that's, I think, what matters to me, so you'll be having to listen to that. What matters when we transform our materials is that we pay enough attention to the traces of what we've done, possibly. When we visit buildings, we often see the marks, small marks of what has happened to the material when they were fabricated, and it sometimes looks almost as a sort of abstract painting or an abstract piece of work. When I started working at Arup, I started working with Peter Rice, and some of you may know that he believed that the expression of the making craft would make it easier for us to relate to our built environment, to make it more approachable. And he called that the trace de la main, and he'd done a lot of work on the Pompidou Center with the Gerberet, for example, to try and have pieces in there which didn't come out of a pure industrial process but had the traces of the hand and could be hopefully helping people to relate to the building in a more sort of human manner. I think one of the things also one forgets often is the dimension of time. On what we do, the design phase and then the making phase, are only actually small parts of the life of the building we build and the environment we build. But there is no mechanisms by which we can maybe capture some of the later evolutions of our buildings in the virtual world. We decide what the building is going to be and we freeze it in the virtual world, and then we make it happen. In a way, gardens might be a more interesting example of what possibly could happen, or at least something that would be worth asking ourselves in the context of that discussion. Is, garden design takes time. It doesn't happen overnight, and it will evolve, and there will be reactions to what happens to the design as the time passes. And I think we seem to forget a lot that things will age. We maybe place no value into this, apart from a few maybe cases. We don't care that the rain might make our stone faces weep, or that the sun will transform the sort of color of our timber claddings in different layers. So I think we should harness more or think more about what happens after we have finished our work and how that might be valued and included in the design of what we do. So basically, I'm going to advocate perverting the tools. Louis Kahn said it probably more beautifully than I will, so I borrowed from him. There is a belief that the virtual world will basically remove the pain of building, will remove the unfortunate in the sentence previously. But I would believe that actually the virtual world remains only what we've embedded him to do. And this little avatar of a walking person shows that, maybe sort of almost like a joke, but he's only doing what he has been embedded to do. And what we knew about his behavior, or the behavior we were looking at in this instance. When we build our virtual models or BIM models, which are extraordinary tools. I'm not it's not a rant against those. It's much more that I would wish they could do even more, that they could be more clever, that they could have a better representation of all the interactions and all the aspects of the act of building and materials. They, I believe, remain an oversimplification of reality. And they lack a certain amount of maybe imperfection. And that's kind of weird, but that's, I was visiting one of Louis Kahn's building over the summer as I was preparing this, and just that tiny little nick of the concrete, which gives that tiny little piece of light on the surface, that gave me pleasure. And you wouldn't, you don't know how to capture these sorts of things in the models we do and in the work we do. So I believe there's more to it. Until our buildings are made the way they are made, i.e. fabricated of a multitude of pieces, I think there is a chance that these accidents, these happy accidents, these slight imperfections will remain in our buildings and in our enjoyment. But there is a dream that actually the tools would remove that way of building, that we will be able to maybe one day press the button and say print, that we would completely sort of remove the part in a way of the hands are involved in the making, and just basically turn our building out of frozen goo, ink in a way, as we call it. I think the day we do this, or we think this is the valuable outcome or the valuable aim of the latest technology, I think we will have lost a great deal of what we do. So I really think we need to pervert our tools slightly and embed in them a lot more things than what they have currently in them. We could maybe embed imperfection slightly. We could maybe embed sort of natural textures to them, if that's what we're after. Artists are probably better than we are at perverting the tools. This is the tools of Soulage. I've deliberately chosen an analog set of tools to show you, but it could have been something else. And he used all sorts of non-painting tools to do his paintings because he felt the results were more interesting and more worthy. So in a way, he was diverting tools from their obvious use into something that was serving his purpose. And I think we probably need to think about what our purpose is more than we often do. Of course, we're only at the beginning of these tools. When I started in Arup, AutoCAD didn't exist. So I think there is a lot of room for further development, a lot of room for inventing better tools, inventing better virtual worlds. But I think for that, the purpose has to be that it serves the real. Otherwise, we are at risk of losing a great deal. We, at the moment, often, and in a way I'm going to bounce off Tristram's talk, which some of you may have seen, who actually probably had the title that I should have taken, and ended up sort of almost describing a world where the human is not involved in neither the design nor the making of what we do, and where it becomes the fruit of an industrialized process. And I really worry that this is what we're using this immense power of our computers, our virtual representation for. I think it also makes it too easy. You go from a design and then say print. Is that a worthy design? Is that a good design? Is that elegant enough? And I think the question of contending with the real forces, contending with the materials in a more maybe manual way is important, and it sort of re-injects into what we do questions of craft, questions of scale, questions of human interaction, questions of time, context, culture, all these things that our tools do not have and are too easily forgotten. And that also probably means that once that has been those considerations have been re-injected in our decisions and in our making, we stand a better chance of having a good result, or a result that will be enjoyed for years to come. So just to conclude, despite the incredible power of our virtual world, I think our priority should be the real and its relation to the human. Thank you.
It was very interesting, especially because she really pointed out the importance of the durability and the emotional sensation that you have about the materials, which I think we need to keep more in consideration in our everyday design, specifically in terms of duration or durability of our buildings, and how to use better material, use them in a better way to improve the lifespan of the buildings, and the durability and the human sensation that we have for them.
I thought it was very good. I thought it was probably one of the more powerful short talks I've heard in the last couple of years. Yeah, I think it was really spot on. And in fact, what she explained is what architecture is, which is what you can't measure, what you can't calculate, but coming from the engineering side. So I thought it was powerful. Her images were also very well picked, especially the Sydney Opera House, because most of us are from Sydney.
What I felt was very interesting in Sophie's talk is that at the moment there are two camps in architecture, and one is very much on the side of the digital world, and there is an expectation that all the buildings one is going to make are going to come out of the design process in a way like solidified ink. And then I think partly as a result of the widespread use of computer modeling, there has been a reaction with another group of architects who have tended to dismiss the possibilities of digital technologies. And I think what was very interesting in Sophie's talk is that she is trying and wanting to put those two sides together in a way which architects actually quite rarely, I think about or articulate. And I think it was made, in fact, even more provocative because of the fact that it came from an engineer. It's a kind of rappel à l'ordre, as the French would say. So I enjoyed it very much.
I thought it was fantastic to hear engineers talking about, she called it the imperfection, but it's really the accidental. And I think how you control the accidental and manipulate it really makes a place more interesting for people. The discovery of that was great. It's great hearing engineers talking about that aspect, because that, to me, is one of the great qualities of architecture, is the stuff that you don't necessarily intend, but you are controlling it. So that was kind of a fabulous insight.
I thought Sophie's talk was one of the most beautiful, sensitive talks I've heard in a long time. But I think there were kind of levels of frustration that was inherent in the kind of way in which she interacts with architects, and she has a very sensitive architectural side as well as engineering, and I think that the projects could benefit more from more interaction between architect and engineer working together rather than testing architectural proposition. So it would be very, very rewarding, I think, to work with Sophie on a project like that.